Today on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino, we're going to discuss crime and punishment, not by Dostoevsky, but by two writers who have unique stories to share. A leading crime reporter who knows more about the sensational Clark Rockefeller murder mystery than anyone will share unique insights captured in his book, Name Dropper, Investigating the Clark Rockefeller Murder. And also with me today is one of the most famous and recognizable criminal defense attorneys in the country. He's here to discuss his new book, Mistrial. It's an insider's look at how the criminal justice system works and doesn't work. You won't want to miss this show. So let's ask the question. I'm Anthony Portantino, and welcome to The Question Is. My guest today is the newspaper man that author James Ellroy called a pit bull crime reporter, Frank Girardot. When he's not writing crime novels, Mr. Girardot is the managing city editor of the San Gabriel Valley newspaper group, where he oversees 3 newspapers. We're going to delve into his local sensational murder mystery and get some hard case answers. Let's ask the question. Mr. Girardot, Frank.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. Clark Rockefeller. The question is he guilty?
Well, a jury found him guilty.
Well, that's not an answer.
A judge will sentence him, and I think you're asking me, do I believe he's guilty?
Do you believe is he guilty?
Well, certainly in this case where you have one murder that's been tried and he's been convicted of it, there's not a doubt that he's guilty. The real question is what happened to the victim's wife?
Right.
And perhaps that's a question that'll never be answered.
So let's tell folks, there were 2 people who disappeared. He was a tenant in a house, and the 2 people who lived in the main house, husband and wife, disappeared, but only one body's been found all these years.
Right. Well, this is a story with lots of twists and turns, a lot of characters, and it spans over 3 decades nearly. It involves a guy who came to the United States, a German immigrant, lived in San Marino for a while, he's a notorious con man. And
well, first he pretended to be a film student, right?
He's pretended to be a film student, a director. He's pretended
royalty.
to be royalty, a member of the Rockefeller family, and a ship's captain related to the famous Francis Chichester, who sailed the globe.
And so he comes here with all of those aliases that some he played and some he was yet to play, and ends up in San Marino, California.
Right. Yes, he ends up in San Marino, and he's living in the back house of an estate on Lorraine Road with a mom, her son, and the son's wife. In 1985, the son and the son's wife disappeared, and shortly thereafter, this man disappeared too.
Now, originally, he was not considered a person of interest in the disappearance. That came later.
Well, originally, no, there was no person of interest in a disappearance because this was a couple in their 20s who went on, supposedly, to find a job in New York. So
there were also postcards from Europe, too, that were sent?
That's there's, like I say, there's a lot of twists and turns in this case. One of the main pieces of evidence that used in this murder trial and looked at extensively was 3 postcards sent from this missing woman, postmarked Paris, and received by her friends in San Marino and Thousand Oaks.
Let's back up for a second. So we're in the early 80s, and this guy is in his early 20s, right?
Right.
And he shows up in San Marino, and he starts doing fundraisers for the Olympics, for the local church. He just sort of embedded himself into the community.
The greatest thing about this particular con man is he was able to do that. He was able to get close to people in power. He primarily did it through church membership. By joining the Church of Our Savior in San Gabriel, he was able to get close to people who did those things, fundraise for the schools, have fundraisers for the Olympic team of San Marino, the country. And all these ways that he was not only able to get involved with these people, but ingratiate himself into society. And it's a great way to pose as royalty and then project it out at these various functions.
And they talked that he had an exotic accent, and that sort of helped his assimilation into this world, because people found him charming, exotic, and intelligent.
Yes,
I guess.
yeah, they found him all of those things, and he is. You know, I've talked to him,
Right.
and he is charming, very charming, and he does have an interesting accent, and intelligent. I mean, you know, as smart as anybody I've ever met.
And so he ends up in San Marino. He's telling everybody he's a USC film student, which again, he then starts helping with some of the local TV productions in town and the theater productions. And so he really became part of the fabric of the community. And then all of a sudden, this couple disappears.
Right. And shortly thereafter, he disappears. And he tells people that his family back east, a prominent member of that family, has died and left him some money or left him a part of an estate, and he needs to go and take care of it. And he leaves and he goes to Connecticut. But when he arrives in Connecticut, he's driving the missing man's truck, and he's assumed a new name. He's no longer Chichester, he's Crow. Movie, not just film student, now he's a movie producer and telling folks that he's involved in the Alfred Hitchcock show,
Right.
and other sorts of
And then he
TV.
gets married too, right?
Well,
Or is that later?
that comes later. He had been, it's so, like I say, there's a timeline on this that stretches from 1980 to 2013. But he had been married before he got to San Marino to get a green card. When he gets back east and he's Christopher Crow, he's just Christopher Crow. But he eventually adopts the name Clark Rockefeller. And it works. It buys him entree, and it gives him a cachet.
So Clark Rockefeller of the Rockefellers.
Of the Rockefellers. Although if you asked him that, he'd say, well, you know, we're part of the poor Rockefeller family.
Right, because even when he did a primetime interview, he was asked directly by the reporter, are you a Rockefeller? And he said yes.
Well,
I mean, even when he was in custody, he still was perpetuating the lie, right?
To this day, he's perpetuating several lies. That, you know, he's a person who has been diagnosed psychologically with a condition called pseudological fantastica.
Pseudological fantastic. I've never heard of that one.
Not very few people have, but it's on the DSM spectrum.
Oh, is it really?
And it involves people who are incapable.
It's like narcissism on steroids.
Yes, and full of lies. You know, because some narcissists can be truthful.
Right.
So he's beyond narcissism, and now he's into this like a Walter Mitty type of persona.
So he ends up on the East Coast. Was he the film director first or a Rockefeller?
Well, so when we first arrived, he said he was a film director, and he said that he had ties to this Alfred Hitchcock TV show that
Right.
was out on TV in '85 and '86. But at some point, remember now, he was driving the dead man's truck.
Right.
So at some point, he went to sell that truck.
Right.
And when he did, it sent off alarm bells back in San Marino, where the police said, hey, these people that have been missing all these years, their truck's for sale. We should go look into it. Well, when they did, they found out that this guy, it was just the guy, the renter. So they had some suspicions that maybe he knew what happened to the couple, but there was still no body and still no way to say exactly what happened. When they dug further, the truck disappeared.
Let's go back to the no body. So the couple disappears. The investigation never did any investigation of their looking for their bodies, because it wasn't until the mom sold the house and then somebody was putting a pool into the backyard that the Bobcat skip loader hit something.
I mean, you nailed it. It was actually 9 years after this couple disappeared. The house has been sold, and you guys live in there. San Marino, he wants a pool in the backyard. So, you know, they dig a hole for the pool, and they uncover the body of John Soas, missing for these 9 years.
No Mrs. Soas.
No Mrs.
And to this day,
Linda
she's never been found, right?
They have never found Linda Soas.
So the body's found, blunt trauma.
Blunt force trauma to his head. His head's been crushed by a blunt object.
That tells him it's
and the
murder.
body's been cut into 3 pieces.
Now there was some
and wrapped in plastic. specifically, John's head was put into a book bag from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee.
And that became one of the key pieces of prosecution evidence,
well, very
right?
key piece of evidence. It turns out that, this Chichester, whose real name, by the way, is Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter, had attended this university. And, how many people in San Marino have gone there and lived in that same house and happen to have a couple go missing from that house?
So he puts the head in his old book bag, buries it in the backyard where it lays there for 8 years until somebody wants to put a pool in the backyard.
Right, and then it's dug up. And so that's indicative of murder: buried body, book bag, trisected, blunt force trauma.
Not the usual day in San Marino.
No, certainly not. In fact, if you were to, look at the history of crime in San Marino, you'd find very few homicides there.
All right, so they find the body of the husband, blunt force trauma, murder took place. Now he becomes a person of interest in that investigation. But by this time, he's married, and he's married, divorced, and has a 7-year-old kid. Tell us what happens now after the divorce with the 7-year-old daughter.
Okay, well, so he becomes Clark Rockefeller. He gets married, and he marries a woman who's a really well-known European management consultant. Her name is Sandy Boss, and she makes lots and lots of money. So when you want to,
he spends it.
He spends it because, remember, he's a Rockefeller. And she asks him a lot, hey, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm an international investment banker, whatever it is that he does.
She marries him.
Yeah. Well, she gets the Rockefeller name, too.
Right.
So there's motives within motives within motives. Anyway, after a time, they get divorced. And the divorce settlement is this. She maintains custody of the kid, their daughter, Ray. He gets supervised visitation and also $800,000 in cash.
So he gets a big payout, and she gets to keep the daughter, permanent custody of the daughter, but he's not happy about that because he's decided he
wants his daughter to be a part of his life. So in 2008, he kidnapped her during a supervised visitation in Boston and took off with this little girl.
I found it fascinating that the limo driver, who was an unwitting accomplice to taking the daughter, when he finds out what happens, he doesn't go to the police.
Yeah, right.
He changes the decals on his car. There's so many people who, some did the right thing throughout this story,
Right.
and some sort of did the wrong thing, who really weren't accomplices but acted like them.
And if you went back and I asked the limo driver, well, why did you do that? Well, I didn't want to get involved, and
Right.
I think he was worried that he would somehow be arrested for the kidnapping because he was driving.
He was driving, even though he didn't know what was going on. So the kidnapping led to his arrest on kidnapping charges, which is then how San Marino.
Well, and then San Marino says, hey, these fingerprints of this guy match this guy we've been looking for with this cold case.
We don't have a lot of time, but I do want to talk about the trial relied heavily on circumstantial evidence.
It's all completely circumstantial evidence.
There's no physical evidence that tied him to the crime other than the book bag.
And that's circumstantial.
But you feel very confident that the jury came to the right conclusion.
Oh, I mean, there's no doubt that the jury came to the right conclusion. He killed this man for sure.
Recently, he reached out to you from prison.
Yeah, from jail.
He's claiming he's got new evidence to find out or that he can prove he's innocent.
Right.
So he's still saying he's innocent. You say he's guilty. It's all covered in the book Name Dropper, which you can get where?
You can buy this at Amazon.com or at RockefellerMystery.com.
And the story's not over because this guy is claiming he's innocent. He's smart enough to get the judge to have him come back into court and try to claim it. We think he's guilty. Author Frank Girardot says he's guilty. Stay tuned for the Name Dropper case as it continues to unfold.
Who needs this modern world? I can live just fine out here without the road rage and boy bands. Of course, I might miss my Charter HD with football on ESPN and Walking Dead on AMC. ESPN and AMC. And, well, Shark Week on Discovery HD. But that's all. AMC, ESPN, Discovery, TBS, and Comedy Central HD. But that's it. Except for HBO HD.
Charter now has over 100 HD channels and more brilliant HD shows on demand than ever.
We're back on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino, and I'm very pleased to have one of the most famous and infamous people in California, famed criminal defense attorney Mark Geragos. I don't think there's a person in California that knows more about the criminal justice system and its sensational impact on real people and pop culture than Mark. He's going to discuss his new book, Mistrial, how things work and sometimes don't work in the courthouse. So let's ask the question. Mark, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Anytime I can get to Irwindale, I try to do it.
Well, we are in beautiful downtown.
We are in beautiful downtown Irwindale. I just wish the Raiders were here, but other than that.
That might happen someday.
Oh, I know. Roski's got a fight on his hands.
He's working on it. But today I want to talk to you. I actually finished reading it last night.
Why?
Mistrial.
Why?
Why? Because I was interviewing you today.
Okay, good.
So
good.
I wanted to make sure I read the book.
Okay, as long as you purchased it, that's all I care about.
You know, I downloaded it into my Kindle. So we're here to talk about Mistrial. And one of the questions, obviously, you talk about your cases. You talk about what brought you to be an attorney, why you are passionate about being a criminal defense attorney. But you raise an important question at the end of the book. Is the system working? And so I want to sort of jump to the end of the book. Hopefully, folks out there, there's a lot to get there, and it's fun to talk about the cases. But the philosophical question, tell me what your opinion on the state of the criminal justice system
you
today.
often hear people say it's the greatest system in the world, and if it isn't perfect, well, there's what's the next best thing. I would argue with that. In a lot of cases, I don't think that this is the greatest system in the world. I think that if you're in the courthouses every day like we are, you will see that there is a lot of injustice. The last place you're going to find justice is in the halls of justice. There are all kinds of people who I think don't quite understand until they get in the midst of this, until they get into the maw of the criminal justice system, just what a nightmare it can be. I know, frankly, that for certain communities, they're disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. You go into a superior courtroom anywhere in LA County, for instance, and we practice all through the state, and so I see it everywhere in the state of California. All we're doing is basically processing the same people over and over again. And a lot of people will say, well, then that's great. Maybe we just build more prisons. Well, we've been down that road. Right. It didn't work too well. You would know better than anybody else in the legislature that every time you start building more prisons, you take away from the educational system in California, and that's not a solution.
And we have a revolving door in that the recidivism rate, 70% in California. So, I've always felt we need to focus on lowering the recidivism rate.
Well, one of the ways you lower the recidivism rate, what the Superior Court has become on the state side is we do nothing but deal with the war on drugs. That's all we have. You sit in any courtroom, and like this morning, 80% of what goes on there is either a drug-related offense or something that has to do with addiction. And so we've spent all of this money and all of our resources in terms of fighting a war that is frankly unwinnable. And all the problems that we have tend to flow from that.
Well, obviously you hear the struggle between prevention and dealing with the aftermath, and we certainly as a society, education is the key. I mean, the more educated your society is,
and you got to start early. And you got to start early. It was the old Henry James adage that give me a kid till he's 7 and I'll determine him for the rest of his life. Right. So that is, and you see it in the system. And if you realize, and if people realized how much of their tax dollars go towards the prison system and how ridiculous it is, I think they would balk. I mean, I was up at San Quentin a couple of months ago, which has to be one of the most beautiful pieces of land in California, sitting out there on the bluff. You
come around the corner and there
it is, and it's gorgeous.
And across the street are $7 million homes.
Right, and then you go inside of that hellhole, and it's unconscionable to me as to what we're doing with people. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a bleeding heart who thinks that there isn't a role for incarcerating people or warehousing people. Clearly there is. There's a certain part of the population that have kind of forfeited their right to be in with the rest of the population. However, the overwhelming majority of the people that are incarcerated, we could do a lot better things with.
Well, we certainly have to make sure that they don't keep going back in with the revolving door. I do want to ask you a question. Obviously, you have dealt with both the media, probably more significantly than most criminal defense attorneys, as well as celebrity clients. In your book, you take on the pundits pretty hard. You go after some of the folks who have made a career out of trashing just about everybody and anything to make a buck for sensationalism. And I thought that was interesting that, you didn't pull any punches.
Well, it's part of what I do. I mean, I am a pundit, and one of the reasons I do that, I came to criminal defense. I grew up watching Perry Mason. So some people.
So did my mother. My mother loved that show.
It's the greatest show. And my favorite book is To Kill a Mockingbird, and I loved the movie with Gregory Peck. And the criminal defense lawyer, when I was growing up, was kind of a noble profession.
Right.
You would be there standing between the government and maybe a client that was clearly unpopular. And you were not out there running for a popularity contest. You weren't running to win political office. I often joke, the last person I think who was a criminal defense lawyer who was president of the United States was Abraham Lincoln. So, I mean, it is not something where you're going to curry favor with the public. But what has happened in the last 30 years with the politicalization of the criminal law is you've seen this kind of rise of what I call the angry white blonde woman, ex-federal prosecutor.
Ann Coulter.
Ann Coulter would be one, Nancy Grace is another, who have made a currency out of the idea of prejudging people as guilty prior to them having their day in court. And I think that's awful.
And of course, you made the point that oftentimes when they're wrong, they don't ever say, I was wrong.
Well,
that never makes it
there
into
was
their...
a famous case of a guy who was Secretary of Labor, and I think it was under Reagan's administration, I could be wrong, but Ray Donovan. They've now got a series under the same name. Ray Donovan was indicted, tried, acquitted, and he came out on the courthouse steps in D.C. and said, okay, now where do I go to get my reputation back? It's a lot of times, as I tell clients, you can beat the rap, but not the ride. It's an awful, awful thing to have to go through.
Well, one of the things that's interesting in your book, you talk about the psychology of juries, you talk about jury selection, you talk about what brought you to be who you are today, and I like the fact that you write about your dad a lot too. You know?
Well, I do. My dad was my hero. I used to follow him around. I was raised by a veteran homicide prosecutor for the first 13 years of my life. And in fact, I always jokingly say for the first 13 years of my life, I thought my first name was dumb and my middle name was, well, it's a family show, so we can't say it, because that was the way he referred to me. But I idolized him when he was practicing. I love him. He's still alive today, obviously.
Absolutely,
and,
I know him well.
And you know him well, and you know my mother well, who, by the way, wants a jacket. She still says she
she
needs the Portofino jacket.
You didn't give her the one I gave you.
I did not. I glommed
kept
onto
it.
that. I kept
All
it.
right,
Don't tell Mom. But the thing about it is I watched what he was doing as a prosecutor, and I thought that was the greatest kind of drama, and you could make an impact. One of the things that's happened in my career in the last 10 years is, as I said, I started off doing the criminal defense because I liked the idea of being able to kind of defend the individual or the underdog against the government.
Finch.
Yeah, exactly. But I've noticed in the last 10 years that one of the things that's happened is that kind of denigrating of the criminal defense lawyer has now happened in the consumer area. Corporations and large business interests have now kind of beating up on the lawyers who handle that stuff. So obviously I'm attracted to that now. So I've been, in the last 10 years, actively suing now insurance companies, banks, and large corporate interests.
One of your, I think, personal but very important cases is dealing with the Armenian genocide. You had plaintiffs who, was it MetLife or who?
New York Life,
Life.
And another company, AXA. In fact, Marty Marudian, who was in La Cañada, and
Right.
I grew up with his kids, was one of the first guys to start to try to collect against New York Life. And we ended up, and that was one of the reasons I started getting into the civil practice, we ended up pursuing these federal class actions for the insurance benefits in the Ottoman Empire that
People
were given.
who actually had insurance policies.
They had bought insurance policies and then were wiped out during the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923 and have never been able to collect. And so I tell a great deal about that in the book, or talk a great deal, and it's very meaningful for me.
Absolutely, and it's also, you've been successful.
We're very proud of the fact that we've collected on over $37.5 million on some of these lawsuits, and we've given back over $10 to $12 million in Cypre funds, which means funds that go to public interest type.
Fantastic. Now, you've represented a lot of celebrities.
Yeah, for better or for worse.
For better or worse. And I'm sure you've liked some of them better than you haven't liked others. I mean, what can you tell me Can you say what your favorite?
Well, somebody asked me.
People are asking me to say, all right, what's his favorite celebrity trial or least favorite, if you want to go that way too.
They always ask who are the clients you like the most, and the two clients right now that I would say celebrity clients that I'm closest to would probably be Mike Tyson and Chris Brown, and which people always say, well, why? And I say, with pun intended, but they were both knocked down and have tried to get back up. Kind of wags will say, well, that's because they've knocked people down. Well, I understand that, but they are people who are trying to get through that process of redemption, which I like, and I think most Americans do. Most Americans like the idea of somebody, if you've been knocked down, there is a story of redemption. They are both fascinating men and who have had great adversity and are fighting through it. One of my favorite clients of all time would probably be Susan McDougal. She kind of changed the arc of my career 15 years ago. And she was, for those who don't remember, she was the business partner of Bill and Hillary Clinton in the Whitewater investigation. In fact, I was just down in Louisiana.
And that's where you and Pat.
That's where Pat and I came in. In fact, my co-author, Pat, was engaged to Susan when she hired me, and he came in and tried to fire me, and he ended up working with me for 17 years.
Let me ask you, is there one trial, and it doesn't have to be a celebrity trial, is there one trial or one battle that you feel the most proud of that makes you say, this is what I became a lawyer, sort of?
One of the cases that I think was, I don't know if it's most proud, but one that I think was significant was I had a young man in Glendale who had been incarcerated and charged with a death penalty, special circumstance charge of murder. And the family came, and they really couldn't afford us, but I cut him a break, and because I felt strongly about the family. It became apparent to me quickly that he was not guilty, and for a variety of reasons, and we got out and we investigated it. Unfortunately, he spent 8 months in custody while we were trying to prove it. Eventually, the case was dismissed, finding of factual innocence. I could get into the details, but we don't have enough time. We ended up suing the police department in that case, the Glendale Police Department, and hitting in federal court for $1,700,000. And I thought that all in all that was, and I could go on for hours about that case, but for a number of reasons, it pointed out some of the problems in the criminal justice system. He was there because the police, in my opinion, had done a shoddy job, the Glendale Police Department, in terms of their eyewitness identification. And that's one of the big problems in the criminal justice system. People and jurors are convinced that when somebody gets up on the stand and points to somebody in a courtroom, they did it, that must be it.
And you have a suggestion to change the identification process. We're closing in on our deadline. Can you tell me in 30 seconds?
Sure. I mean, you don't get into a situation where it's suggestive, number one. I mean, legally you're not supposed to, but there are so many ways that it is inherently suggestive. If you take a look at all the people who walk off of death row who were factually innocent now that they're being exonerated with DNA, 70% of those cases that they're found that it's based on faulty eyewitness identification. We've got ways to address that.
Well, if you're interested in the criminal justice system, in some celebrity cases.
Some titillating tidbits.
And, I love the theory about Ann Coulter being in love with Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, right?
That was my favorite part, is that Mr. Geragos has a very good theory on that. The book is Mistrial. Mark Geragos is our guest and friend. Thank you, Mark, for being here.
Anthony, a pleasure to be here.